In a world of boring talk, misinformation, and mindless chatter, two superheroes emerge from the ashes.
Ben, is this asses or ashes?
Bring the action.
Happy hour with Ben and Alexander. Pull up a chair. Raise a glass. And join in the chat. It's talk radio with jazz hands.
Oh my God, you had to say that.
Yes. Gentlemen and gentlemanly ladies. And lady gentlemen. Baba Ganoush? What? You know, Ben, I wish I had 4 arms.
Why do you wish you had 4 arms?
Because we need double jazz hands for today.
Yes, we do. And why is that?
Well, not only do we have author, activist, producer, director Christina Crawford.
Christina Crawford. Yes. Yeah, nice. Very nice.
This is the Christina Crawford who wrote Mommie Dearest, wrote the new editions, the 25th and 30th anniversary, who is now a self-produced, directed, and now stars in a multimedia documentary traveling around the nation.
Oh.
Talking about her life. You know, she's got a whole career on her own as an actress, as a TV producer, and an author, but also talking about her life with you-know-who.
Who?
JC. Not Jesus Christ, but Joan Crawford.
Miss Crawford herself.
So you can imagine how many questions we have.
It's going to be
how
packed full
many
tonight, definitely. So, and with your questions, you guys call in if you guys have some. And let us know what you guys want to find out, and we will make sure we find it out for you.
And if you're looking on camera, we actually have first edition Christina Crawford, A True Story, Mommie Dearest.
I think it's we're gonna move on into. I do believe our first guest is.
I'm so nervous.
Are you nervous? Don't be nervous.
Do I look good?
You look perfect. She's gonna love you.
All right.
I think we do have a guest. Caller, are you there?
I am here. This is Christina Crawford.
How are you, Christina? Thank you so much for calling in. How are you?
Welcome to Happy Hour.
I am very well. We had our first snow here in northern Idaho.
Oh, my gosh.
So it's absolutely beautiful.
I'm sure.
And I'm happy to be with you in Los Angeles.
Thank you so
we
much.
couldn't be more proud to have you on.
We are so excited about your new touring multimedia documentary that you produced, directed, and you star in. Your story now gets to go throughout the nation, and how exciting!
Well, you're so sweet. Thank you so much. Yes, we've been very excited about it. I have a wonderful producer who has made this all possible, Jerry Rosenberg, and it's been an adventure for both of us for the last couple of years. We're going back to New York the week before Thanksgiving to the St. Luke's Theater off Broadway, November 20th to the 22nd. And then I'm speaking at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut, November 23rd, and showing the documentary and talking to college students and faculty. So it's really exciting for me.
Well, congratulations. And, you know, for this interview, I really want to focus on your work as the author. We're not going to discuss the film at all because it did not reflect what the story was, which is really about you and all the things that you've done through your activism and through your involvement. I mean, what an amazing life you have led.
Well, fortunately, although, you know, you never have the anticipation of longevity, it has been a long life, and I've been very fortunate to see all the transitions, and now at this stage of my life be able to go back out into the public and talk to people about keeping the conversation alive about human rights, about don't accept abuse, and discrimination is unacceptable behavior. So I'm very fortunate. I am very, very lucky.
Absolutely. And now it's based on 3 of your best-selling books, correct? It's based on Mommie Dearest, Survivor, and No Safe Place, correct?
That is correct. The documentary, which is titled Surviving Mommie Dearest, is based on those 3 books, and it's really important because the first book was my early life, and it was certainly surviving the abuse, but also about trying to find a relationship with my adopted mother, which in the long run, it didn't work. I tried, but it didn't work, so it was not successful. The second book, Survivor, is the 10 years after Mommie Dearest was initially published. And during that time, I suffered a very, very, very serious illness. And it's about the recovery from that and creating a new way of being in the world after that illness, because there's a lot of people who say that if you don't learn the lesson the first time, sometimes a disaster takes place in your life that says, this is a wake-up call, and you better pay attention. Well, I had my wake-up call at the age of 42, and it took me many years to recover from that, but anyway, I have. And then the third book is No Safe Place, and it's kind of a self-help book for survivors. I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist, but I am a survivor, and I have learned a lot of lessons about PTSD and substance abuse and relationships from my work with other survivors and people in the community that help survivors.
It must it must have taken so much courage to finally tell your story. I mean, everybody has their own idea of who Joan Crawford was, and now with like Turner Classic Movies and, you know, a new generation being introduced to who Joan Crawford appears to the public, it must have taken some real guts to tell your story and kind of go against that, knowing that when you first came out with this book, you weren't going to have the biggest fan base.
Well, nobody was willing to talk about family violence or child abuse in 1978, before you were probably born. But
Aren't
so
you a
let's
doll?
be
Aren't you
honest
a doll?
about that part. but interestingly enough, the mythology was that family violence and child abuse only happened in ethnically impoverished and socioeconomic environments, and not to white people or to people in positions of power, whether that was movie stars or police officers or clergy or whatever, or coaches. And we have learned the hard way that that is simply not true.
Now, you were adopted at just an infant, and when you were 10 years old, you were sent off to boarding school, correct?
That is correct.
So, as a 10-year-old, how do you establish your own identity? How are those first few years from being away from home?
Well, I was very homesick, as most children are if they're sent away from home, and I guess the negative side is that I missed being able to be part of a family. So I never learned how to be part of a family because it didn't exist. I mean, it didn't exist for me. But the positive part is that being sent to boarding school, where I stayed my entire life until I went to college, 2 different boarding schools, but I was there. It probably saved my life, because the environment in the household was so negative toward me and to my brother that I may not have survived intact if I had stayed.
Wow.
That's just remarkable.
And back to the documentary, I mean, it's gaining a lot of recognition as far as, I believe it was in 2013, you received a Bronze Telly Award, correct?
Oh, yes, I'm so pleased about that.
That's
I'm so
incredible.
thrilled. Well, you guys know what the Telly is. The Telly Award looks very much like an Emmy, Excuse me.
That's okay.
But it is for independent production as opposed to studio production, which is the Oscars and the Emmys.
Right.
Excuse me. So we're very thrilled.
Well, and
Jerry had never received a telly before, but I had a television show, an independent television show in Spokane, Washington, in 2008, 2009. And that show received 3 Telly Awards for independent television production and cultural excellence. So I was very thrilled, and he now has his own Telly Award.
Huge
congratulations. And we know here in Hollywood, being an independent anything is not easy whatsoever.
Well, bless your heart. So you know how thrilled we were.
Absolutely.
Miss Crawford, do you think that it was a jealousy issue, the very beginnings of the abuse with your child? When you were first adopted, there was so much press, there were so many publicity shots and pictures, and I mean, you're a very attractive older one, but you were just a real cutie too.
I was adorable. Yes, let's be honest. I was just adorable. But that had nothing to do with publicity. That was God's gift to me.
Yes, ma'am.
Amen.
So I don't know. It's hard to say. Joan Crawford didn't have any success with family before she adopted children either. And so she didn't have success with husbands. She didn't have success with children. She didn't have success with her own mother and father and her mother and brother. So she was not... Well, actually, she was turned down by the county of Los Angeles for adoption because they found her an unsuitable candidate. I know that for a fact.
And so she had to go to Nevada, right?
Well, that was later, because the state of California in those days, long ago, did not permit single women to adopt children, and that had nothing to do with her status or her celebrity or anything. It was just a state law. So she used her old nightclub mafia connections in Las Vegas to effect an adoption there, where the laws were different.
Sure.
How familiar with her work were you growing up in school? I mean, did the other students talk about it when you went home? For the holidays, were you? I mean, how familiar were you with her through her role as an actress?
Well, before I was sent to boarding school, she did win the Academy Award for Mildred Pierce. Mm-hmm. So I was very familiar with that. And I knew the people that she worked with at Warner Brothers, and I knew wonderful people like Johnny Garfield, who was my absolute favorite. And you probably remember that Johnny Garfield and Bette Davis formed the Hollywood Canteen during the war.
Yes.
For service people. Excuse me. And that was the one facility that was not segregated during the Second World War. So Hollywood was segregated during that time, but not the Hollywood Canteen, much to their incredible acclaim, because they felt that, well, Johnny Garfield, was a New York actor, and the Hollywood Canteen was modeled after the New York Canteen, which he was involved with. But because Hollywood was part of the deployment to the Asian theater, they felt that anybody that was serving in the United States to protect our country deserved the services absolutely, unequivocally, and so it was a really amazing feat that they pulled off.
I have so many questions. We actually have.
Just ask away.
I will.
That's what we're here for.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
We actually have a comment from our chat room, and our listener has expressed her sorrow for what you had to go through. But have you found any personal success in the path that you are now on from having been adopted? And we know that you feel that you have survived because of that.
Right.
What other strengths have you built from being adopted and kind of living your own life?
Well, it's basically it is my life, and one of the things that I realized several years ago was that being adopted, one of the issues about adoptees, which not everybody chooses to activate, is that when you're adopted, you don't know what your family looks like. You do not know where you came from. And I realized in the 1980s that was part of my healing. And even though my birth family, although they were not married, so they were two separate issues, I needed to know where I came from, because most people know that. Most people know what their mother's face looks like, what their father's face looks like, and it's a given. Nobody thinks about it. But when you're adopted, you don't know that. And so there's a sort of sense of needing to be grounded in the reality of where you come from that I needed to find out. But you see, when I was adopted, the adoption lie was that my birth mother died in childbirth. So that did two things. It made it impossible for me to think about finding her or information about her, and it also made me guilty for being born.
Oh my God!
So those are two huge hurdles that we need to cross as adults, and many people have that happen to them, but they don't realize how important it is to resolve it.
Yeah.
Ms. Crawford, one of our Uber fans has just thanked you for sharing your story, because apparently your book and your activism has actually helped him through his own abusive childhood.
Thank you. I have heard that for 35 years, and I am deeply grateful.
Ms. Crawford, what comes to your mind when you see pictures of you and Joan and in the early days? I mean, they're splashed all over the place. What comes to your mind every time you come across something?
Well, first of all, I learned how to be an actress at an early age.
Touche.
At a very early age. But the other thing is that I have, when we did the documentary, I did go through the picture book, the family album kind of thing, and I looked at the back of the pictures, and most of them were done by studio photographers, and most of them were done for publicity. I mean, they were all basically done for publicity.
Right.
But I looked at the pictures, specifically the pictures, and this might be of interest to your listeners and viewers, where she and I, now I'm very young, under 10 years old, mostly 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. And we are dressed in matching outfits that had to be made by a dressmaker because they didn't exist anywhere else. And I thought to myself, who is the child here?
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. Very true.
Yeah.
That is a very, very good point. And when you talk about growing up in that kind of environment, in the Hollywood environment, and I'm sure you were around big producers, big, execs all the time.
Stars.
Yeah, and then the people, when you did tell your story, the kind of backlash that possibly did happen to you, what did that feel like for you? The people that knew what was happening, but when you did tell your story, kind of possibly turned against you.
Well, it isn't so much that they turned against me,
Right,
but
right.
they needed to protect their guilt
Yeah.
because they knew perfectly well what had happened, what was going on, as did everybody, except the general public, which the studio publicity people kept it from the general public. So the general public is not to be blamed in any way, shape, or form for their dismay about what was revealed with the original publication of Mommie Dearest. However, when we talk about the studio people or the Hollywood people, they all knew exactly what had happened, not only to me, but also to my brother. And those people who did nothing to intervene or to try and help, or to try and help her, they had to protect their guilty conscience by saying that it wasn't true, they didn't see it, et cetera, blame the messenger for the bad news. However, that's out of guilt. That's not out of reality.
Absolutely.
And you just made a really good point. Is Joan needed some help. Somebody needed to step in there and see what was going on in her mind. Who knows what mental diseases she was suffering from?
Right, and unfortunately, because there were people that tried to suggest that, particularly, interestingly enough, with my brother. But she categorically refused to talk about it, to get help, or to change her behavior. So that is her choice. And it's really, really important to understand that very often the person who is what we call in the child abuse community the perpetrator, that person who is inflicting the harm, there's no way to change them unless they choose to acknowledge their behavior and embrace change. So for people today, now let's bring it to the present. For people today, I often, in my public engagements with people, because I do a question answer after the viewing of the documentary, which is great. I love it. Today, it's important for people to understand that the only person you can change is yourself. And that's possible. That is possible. It might be painful, but it is possible. If you focus on the other person, even if they're still alive, your chances of success are very slim.
Yes.
Very slim, and you will be constantly disappointed, which I really encourage people not to engage in that way, because sometimes you just have to acknowledge bad things happened, and you have to walk away and do your own life. That's what I had to do.
I just have one final question from myself is, as an adult, if Joan were here right now, what would you say to her, and would you be able to forgive her? Because I know that you did have some conversation with her before she died. But what would you say now, with all these years that have passed, with your success and with the people that you've helped?
Okay, well, that's a very legitimate question, except that I just want to say that forgiveness happens within oneself. We are not judges. We are not clergy. Survivors are just survivors, ordinary people. And to put the burden of forgiveness on survivors, I think is unfair, because we have so much to forgive in ourselves for the choices we've made and the mistakes we've made in order to go ahead with our own lives. I did forgive her on some level long before she died. I had to in order to move forward. But I have come to a different understanding of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a two-way street, and particularly for survivors of abuse or violence. If the other person in the situation does not admit or take responsibility for what they did, there is really no forgiveness, because we are not clergy and we're not courts. We're not lawyers. We are not judges. And those people have to come to some understanding that what they did was wrong and make restitution. And sometimes that's never going to happen. So we have to forgive ourselves for our own mistakes and move forward in our own lives.
I don't think you could have said it better, and I can't tell you how honored and proud we are to have had you call in this evening. Thank you so much for being a part of our show tonight.
Well, you're more than welcome, and I hope that those viewers or listeners that have people in the New York area will come to see the show at St. Luke's November 20th to the 22nd, or the Fairfield, Connecticut on the 23rd, because I love to talk to people and we love to show the documentary, and I thank you so much for your time.
Of course.
Absolutely.
And for our listeners and viewers, go to survivingmommiedearest.com for up-to-date information. Miss Crawford, when are you bringing the show to Los Angeles?
Come on out and see us.
Well, you have to get a theater to book us, so if we get a theater that books us, we'll be there.
We're on
got
it.
it.
We are on it.
We will do it.
Okay, that's a deal.
All right.
That's a deal. All right, thank
Happy
you.
holidays to
Thank
you
you
and your
well.
listeners.
Have fun in New York.
Thank you so much. Have a great
Bye-bye.
night. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, my Lord.
Thank you.
Gracias.
We love you guys. Find us on Facebook.
Sasa Productions.
And then sasaproductions.com. You'll find all of our links there. So until next time.